Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming to you today from Ethan and Micaiah's room, and we're going to continue our reading and reflection of Paul's letter to the Philippians. As I mentioned last week, this is a letter that many scholars believe Paul wrote while he was under house arrest. And so, among a lot of other things, what that means is that during Paul's writing of this letter, he was separated from, he was cut off from a lot of the people that he loved. He wasn't able to see in person a lot of the people he cared about. And I think that's something that resonates with us all lately in these past couple of weeks, and something we're all coming to terms with in different ways. So it's a fitting letter for us to read together, for us to think about together, and for us to see what it might be saying to us during this time. So last week I looked at Philippians chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. Today we're going to continue with kind of the second movement in this chapter, Philippians 1. We're going to look at verses 12 through 26. So starting in verse 12, Paul says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me." So we want to look, just starting at the beginning of this passage, we want to look at Paul's perspective on the situation he was in. And he starts by saying, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." As I said before, Paul is struggling at this time. Paul is wrestling with some very difficult realities: his imprisonment, perhaps his impending death. As we'll see, he's thinking in terms of some of the divisions that he's seeing in the church, some of the struggles that the church is having, and that he wants to be able to do something about, but in some ways feels cut off from that situation. So Paul is having a hard time in a lot of ways, and I think that's important to acknowledge, because sometimes Christians are accused of overlooking or failing to acknowledge the darkness that's in the world, the difficulties that are in the world. What Paul's doing here is not, he's not speaking out of a power of positive thinking perspective. He's not speaking out of naivete. Paul is very well aware of the struggles that he is going through, the struggles that others are going through, just as we should be. This world that we live in right now, our communities, our nation, our world, is having a hard time. It's impossible to ignore that. It's impossible to ignore the numbers that we're hearing about people who are sick and people who are dying, families who are losing members, people who are losing their jobs, communities that are devastated by this virus and by all of the fallout from it. It's important that we acknowledge that. Paul is not one to shy away from the hard realities of life. But Paul also starts with this perspective where he says that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And so even as Paul acknowledges the difficulties, even he acknowledges the struggles that are going on in his life and the lives of those around him, he also always wants to ask the question, what is God doing here? Where might God be at work? Where might God's grace be present? And Paul sees that even in the midst of his imprisonment, even in the midst of the struggles he's having, God is present. God's grace is at work. God's power is at work. He says that the whole palace guard and everyone else knows that I am in chains for Christ. Paul is able to speak into the situation that he's in, not with words of fear, not with words of anxiety, but with words of truth, with words of confidence, with a bold proclamation of the gospel. And he says, because of that, other brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord. They dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Whenever we're faced with a situation like the one we're in now, we kind of have two opportunities, two opposing opportunities when it comes to our fear. We can let our fear consume us. We can let our fear overwhelm us. Or we can realize that God is the one who triumphs over our fear. We can realize that in the face of such fear, we can be bold. We have nothing left to lose. We can speak the truth about who Jesus is. We can speak the truth about the hope that he offers. And that's what Paul's doing. And because Paul's doing that in the midst of darkness, in the midst of the struggle that he's having and the difficulties that the church is having, he knows that God is being glorified in that. Now, Paul also knows that there are going to be people who are behaving and acting out of less than pure motives. He talks about those who are preaching out of envy and rivalry. He talks about those who want to divide. There's competition in the church in Paul's day as well as in ours. Just as hardships, just as difficulties can bring us together, can unite us, can bring out the best impulses in us, can drive us to think about how we can love our neighbors and how we can seek the good for our neighbors. It's also a reality that difficult times can also bring out the worst in people. And Paul wants to acknowledge that too. He knows that there are people, including people in the church, who are behaving foolishly. They're behaving selfishly. And he wants to acknowledge that. But even in that, he wants to point out that Christ is still being proclaimed, that God's goodness is still present, and that God's grace is still powerful. And finally, Paul, in these last verses of this passage, he looks at his own mortality. He looks at his own very immediate situation, the very possible and impending reality of his death. Paul is imprisoned at this point. He knows what that means. He's smart enough to know that the Roman Empire had a tendency to persecute those who didn't fall in line, those who proclaimed that Jesus was Lord. And in some ways, Paul was perceived as an enemy by those who were in charge, by those who were in power. Paul knew, he rightly knew, that his life could and likely would come to an end because of this situation he was in. There are a lot of people around us in the world who maybe for the first time in a long time are coming to terms with the reality of that we are mortal, the reality that our life on this earth is not necessarily guaranteed to us. The fact that people around us are getting sick, the fact that we read on the news of people who are in life and death situations, has a way of bringing those realities into stark focus. And again, these are moments when we can be overwhelmed by our fear or anxiety about this. It can cause us to shut down, or it can do what it did for Paul. It can inspire us to say, look, whatever time we have left, whether that's a week or a month or a year or 80 years, whatever time we have left, we can devote it to God's kingdom. We can devote it to the purposes of the gospel. We can ask each day that we might have the courage to live in such a way that Christ will be exalted in our bodies, that Christ will be exalted in the things we do, in the things we say, in the way we love those around us. Paul was in prison. He might have had daily contact with very few people, maybe an occasional visitor, certainly the guards that were around him. But Paul resolved, even in those situations, to do what he could to exalt Christ. And I believe that that's the calling that's placed on each of us. Our opportunities to get out, our opportunities to do the things we normally do, to go to work and to go to school, our opportunities to be out around in our neighborhoods have been severely limited. But in their place, maybe new opportunities have cropped up. New opportunities to love, new opportunities to serve, new opportunities to exalt Christ in our body, so that whether by life or by death, God's name will be glorified. God's name will be praised. And so Paul closes with a passage that I can't help but cling to today. He says, I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Paul believes that he's going to be reunited with the Philippians. I believe, as I'm here in my son's bedroom, sending out a devotional thought, I believe that the time is going to come when we're going to be able to gather again, when we're going to be able to gather in person around God's table, to sing together, to pray together, and just to enjoy doing the things that we used to do together. I don't know when that time's going to be. I don't know if it's going to be in a month or 2 months. But I know that if and when that time comes, we will rejoice. We'll rejoice because even in the midst of our difficulties, we know that our God has been true. God has been true to his promises. God has provided what we need. And God has given us the grace that we need to get through the day. So thank you all for listening. And let's just commit throughout this day, throughout this week, to live in such a way that Christ will be exalted. Thanks, everybody.